Speaking of rigidity, I'm sort of an overconfident kind of person. Always was. I remember when I was a graduate student, I'd never had a job in my life. I was a graduate student, barely a year in this country. And this thing came up, a potential job to design a hospital information system. And I was convinced I could do it, though I'd never seen a hospital information system. I'd actually never been inside a hospital. I was very certain. The more I've worked with entrepreneurs over the years, I find most of them are very certain. So when I saw this book called On Being Certain, Believing You're Right When You're Actually Wrong, I said, it can't apply to me. Our next speaker is a neuroscientist who wrote this book, and I think it's incredibly important in how and why we are confident, overconfident, and how and why we should think about our decisions and what we consider. Robert, come on over. I love this book. It's one of my favorites. So most of you will be wrong often when you're certain. So Robert, tell us about it.
Thanks, Vinod. First of all, I'd like to say it's a pleasure to be among so many successful people and people with money. Being in the university setting, it's kind of a surprise. So what I wanted to do is talk about something that's been a 40-year project, which will not make you any money, but might help the way you think, or think about the way you think. And really what I'd like to talk about today is something called the feeling of knowing. Let's see, this should go next one. There we go. Okay. The two fundamental questions that I'm sure you guys come across every day if you read Daniel Kahneman or you read any book on Freakonomics, and I think I heard today about uncertainty, gut feeling, extreme uncertainty and risk. It's really two fundamental questions. Can we make fully conscious, complex decisions? And then how do we know if they're correct? I think this has been 2,500 years worth of philosophy. I think since the Enlightenment, we believe that we are rational, even though you can go on the websites and see at least 50 different kinds of biases that we think affect our rationality. The question is, to what extent are we able to think through a problem in our head consciously? And I'll just start off with one really simple observation. How many of you people can remember a 10-digit area code and phone number? Okay. How about 12 digits? If you think about it, your brain can only hold about 4 chunks of information at any one time. So if you do the phone number, you do area code, prefix, and then the last 4 digits. So that's 3 chunks of information. You could do it fine. Our brain has a very, very small amount of what you guys would call RAM, what I would call working memory. That's all it can hold. The rest of it then goes down, is stored somewhere while you learn larger chunks of information. So let's say you have a thought that contains 8 variables. You can't keep all 8 of them in your mind at any one time, consciously. They go into the subconscious, where then they are subjected to all of the various computations, unconscious biases, etc. So my question is, when it comes back that you make a decision, how do you know that it's correct? And it's a thing that's bugged me. I started in neurology in the 60s. And back then I was fascinated by what were some original brain stimulation experiments that showed that people had a certain variety of phenomena that ranged from, I think that's correct, to an epiphany, such as William James. Okay, so now I'm going to start off by asking a simple question. How many people here have full knowledge of the details of where they were and what they saw on the morning of 9/11? How many people think that they are fuzzy on the details? So few people. So let's do it one more time to make sure we got this right. Those people who can say chapter and verse of where they were on the morning of 9/11 and remember the details. Okay. That looks like the vast, overwhelming majority of people. So, let me tell you something and see if this will change your mind. When the Challenger study was done, it was there on the morning when the Challenger shuttle blew up. There was a psychology class that took place about an hour after the shuttle explosion. And the psychology professor asked everybody in the class, which was like 150 people, to write down exactly what happened, where they were, what they saw, all the vicious details. He then called them back 2.5 years later and asked them to recite what they thought was correct. Now, the interesting thing was maybe half the people got it completely wrong, but only 10% of the people got all the details. Less than 10% of the people got the details accurately. So they've reproduced this study now with the shuttle study itself, and then with the 9/11 study. So now let me ask you a question. Vast majority of people thought that you were right the first time. Now let me tell you that every time they've done this study, less than 10% of the people have it absolutely right. So now how many of you people think your memory is absolutely correct? So that's all I really wanted to say today. Because if that doesn't do it, nothing does it. So my real question was, why would that be? I mean, this is not like a high priority psychological thing. This isn't something where you guys are proud of having this piece of information. I thought maybe there's something else. And there was one phrase that caught my mind. One of the students, when it was asked, said, now he looked at his journal and he knows that that's what he just, I mean, it's mind-boggling, but he stuck with it. But you guys just stuck with it. Okay? So the question is, what is it that makes people feel that that memory is more correct, the new memory is more correct than the old one? Something's happened during that period of time in the brain. So I question, how did that happen? So it's maybe not quite clear, but during the course of my career, I've had the chance to see some strange neurologic disorders that led some light on this. First one was something called Cotard syndrome. Now, this is when you believe you're dead. Now, it occurs as a result primarily of neurologic diseases, not any particular one area of the brain, so don't go home and think, that one area will do it. But and so I happened to see a patient who had a young woman who had encephalitis, and she believed she was dead. So I said to her, take your pulse. She takes her pulse, and I said, what do you conclude? I conclude that dead people have a pulse. Now you go, how is that possible? Now, when she recovered, she still had the belief that dead people had a pulse that could not be erased from her mind. Okay, so I kept that in the back of my mind. And then I read an interesting study. For those of you who have bad knees, you might enjoy this. A surgeon put together a experiment whereby he wanted to see whether or not sham surgery versus simply washing out osteoarthritic knee versus a total knee clean out, not a replacement, but cleaning out all the osteoarthritic spurs, etc., which would have the best result. Turned out they were all the same. Sham surgery was exactly as good as the most full-blown surgery. That's not surprising if you think about placebo effect, but what was interesting to me is one of the people that was in the study was an elderly gentleman, and he was then told he had the sham procedure, which you think would have negated the placebo effect. But instead, every time he saw the doctor on TV, he said, that's the doctor who fixed my knee. So even though he knew he hadn't had surgery, this was done where they only put a scar in, but they didn't, incision, but they didn't actually do anything at all, he still couldn't get out of his head that his knee was fixed because he was better. And then one third kind of patient group has always been fascinating to me is people who no longer recognize them. It's like they do not recognize the reality for what it is. And the case in point was an art dealer that I took care of who had a very, very small stroke. He had a full recovery within a few hours. But the next morning, he phoned me up and he said, you know, you've got to come over to my house. Somebody's taken out my huge desk and replaced it with a fake. And I said, what do you mean? I go over there and there's a desk that can't possibly have gotten out at the doors because it was too small. It hasn't been assembled inside the room. And I said, you couldn't possibly get this out of the room. He says, I know. But he ran his hand over the desk and he said, you know, this desk does not feel familiar anymore. Then I recalled back one of the reasons that I went into neurology in the 60s was because of some stimulation experiments that were done on the brain by a famous neurosurgeon, Wilder Penfield, in which he could invoke this sense of familiarity simply by stimulating the brain. There was no object attached to it. In other words, there was a sense of familiarity, and deja vu would be one close kissing cousin, so to speak. So what I was struck by is that there's something in the brain that generates a very strong sense of belief system, of being right. But it isn't necessarily associated with any particular thought at all. And then I reflected back on college days to William James. And William James, in his varieties of religious experience, described a bunch of people with nitrous oxide, with ether, and then more recently it's with ecstasy and other kinds of party drugs, so to speak, where people describe a sense of understanding everything about how the world works, but it's in an instant. Is a feeling of special knowledge that these people have without there being an associated fact. Now that to me is a stunning idea, a sense of knowledge, but there's nothing you're knowing. That makes no sense. So William James made the statement, which I think may be will turn out to be one of the cornerstones of modern neuroscience. Although these are feelings that the person is experiencing, it is a feeling that feels like knowledge. Now, someone earlier today mentioned gut feeling. Well, gut feeling is a feeling of being on the right track. Well, gut feeling would be an example of this. So let's just take a look at the difference between knowledge and feeling. Everybody knows that 2 and 2 is 4. Does everybody also feel that 2 and 2 is 4? I mean, do you feel down in the depths of your soul that 2 and 2 is 4? Everybody also knows that this is true. But I imagine there are relatively few people here who actually have a feeling of knowing about that. They have the intellectual knowledge, but it's unassociated with that visceral sense, I know that's right. Well, we know it's right because we see it on T-shirts, but we don't know it's right because we can work it out. Now, to put this in another perspective, everybody's seen this optical illusion, I presume. That we know that the lines, I'm going to just tell you that the 2 lines measure exactly the same. But the top line looks longer than the shorter line, than the bottom line, doesn't it? How many people think that the 2 look the same? How many think they look different? Okay. Now, what's interesting about this is I've given this particular slide in presentations before in which I felt, well, this is something built into the brain related to the arrows going this direction versus the other direction, and it gives you two inputs to your visual system, one of which is telling you that one line's longer than the other. But there was a really interesting experiment done recently in which they took 14 different groups of people ranging from Western-educated college students to some tribes in so-called rural Africa. And it turned out that the people in Africa saw no illusion at all. And it turns out there's a gradation based upon your degree of education and exposure to Western values that determines how you see something as simple as the length of a line. Now that's stunning to me because what it tells, that the conclusion of the authors is that that even the most straightforward biologic concepts such as visual perception may have a cultural influence. But now I want you to see how this so-called, I call it the feeling of knowing for lack of a better word, actually affects how you read something. So if you've seen this before, don't volunteer because you can only read this once. Once you have seen the answer, you can never go back again to seeing it another way. So read this, and then I'm going to ask you people, how many feel that this makes sense? Yeah. I read this the first time. I actually was reading about something else, and I said, I don't know what this means. I have no idea. But what I want you to do is experience the feeling that overcomes you when I do this. Now, it doesn't take a millisecond for you to say, oh, that's the right answer. Suddenly it all fits. But you didn't have to go back and reread this whole paragraph. It all took place in an instant. Now, does kite feel like the right answer for this now? Does it seem like a kite's right? Okay, let me tell you that the kite's not the right answer. It's hard to get it out of your mind because it's stuck in there. The fact is you had a piece of knowledge and then it feels correct. The two are welded together. If I told you this was some nonsense poetry, you go, no, it's a kite. I mean, what's happened is that they were melded together. So I question, how does that work? So it occurred to me that there's probably an easier way to think about the way the body works than sort of traditional philosophy and neurology. If you think about it, we have sight and sound. We get information from our environment in the form of sensation. And then we get information from our bodies in the form of sensations from our internal organs, hunger, thirst. But just a minute ago, I mentioned to you, and I think it's probably most people would agree, that 95+% of cognition goes on unconsciously. So it would make sense that there should be some sort of sensory system for unconscious cognition, sort of a mental dashboard that will tell you what's going on unconsciously. Otherwise, your thought would have no meaning. So there must be sensations from the brain that describe the quality of your thoughts that are occurring outside of your consciousness. And then I realized, okay, that must be how the feeling of knowing arises. So to get a picture about how this might work is let's think about recognizing a face. You look at a person's face, you're in a crowd at a football game. There are 10,000 people there and you don't see anybody. And all of a sudden you see 4 rows down your friend Sam. Now you didn't consciously recognize him. Your brain was scanning all the things and doing pattern recognition, and when it got to a certain threshold of likelihood, it goes, that's Sam. What you experience is the conscious feeling of recognition. You actually experience, aha, that was Sam, as though you did this consciously. So you had the unconscious calculation, and then you have the degree of likelihood of the calculation being right. Your unconscious still at work. And then when it gets to a critical level, it says, I think that is Sam. And when it gets to a high enough level, it goes, it's Sam. But in order for you to appeal to you as being Sam, it's got to go, that's Sam. So now what we have is the computation, which is without any feeling, and the sensation, which brings it into consciousness, and which you experience combined as the recognition. My point is the calculation that occurs unconsciously is not the sensation. They are separate. And you can see them. Then I went back to thinking about the people that I mentioned, like the man looks at his table. Now he still sees the same pattern, but he's now stripped of the sensation. So in that particular situation, the computation and the feeling are separated. And in these sort of neurologic situations, you now realize 2 separate systems. There's computational thought, and there's the feeling it creates in your mind. So just to see how this works, how many of you people think this is an H? Okay, how many think it's an A? How many can't tell? So we got 2 can't tells. So half think it's an H, and half think it's an A. Is that about? Try it again. How many think it's an H? How many think it's an A? How about now? So what you experienced, when you experienced this moment, your brain made a calculation. It gave you a likelihood. And for those who said H, it was more than 50% chance that it was H. And for those who said A, it was more than 50%. And then it also gave you a feeling that must be right. So you got the combination of the calculation. And so then the question is, why would this be? Why would you have thoughts? Why would you have feelings that feel like thoughts? And if you think about it, you guys start a business. You're going to say, I'm going to start a business, or I'm going to write a novel, or I'm going to do a research project. How would I know when to start something? I've got to know that I'm on the right track before I begin, or at least think I'm on the right track. There's just got to be some likelihood of success, or you wouldn't bother. So you have to have something in your brain that tells you, I think this is going to be right, this is going to work out, before you have any evidence at all. And I think you saw in the first talk today about most of these are experiments, which are risk. It's true because you can't possibly know. But nobody here ever started a business because they thought it wouldn't work. And no one ever started a novel without the idea, I think this is a great idea. Now, it may peter out as time goes along, but it starts off with a feeling. And if you think about it, we need a circuitry in our brain that stops thought from being constantly recursive. In other words, you say, I think it's a good idea to start the business, but how do I know that the thought about it's a good idea to start the business is itself correct? How do I know that the thought about that thought is correct? And so on. I need something that will interrupt this circuit. I need something that feels just like a thought, but isn't a thought. Something that stops me in my tracks, goes, I'm right. So the brain, if a lion's charging at you, you really don't have time in evolutionary terms to go, well, the odds are 73% if I climb the tree. It's just too late. So you go, I'm right, I'll climb the tree. That's the best thing. It may not be the best long-term strategy, but it's the only strategy that will make sense, is to know right away I've made the right decision. So for evolutionary reasons, we've developed what I would call a need for a sensory system for the correctness of a thought. The thing about it, it has to feel identical for it to have meaning, to have being a thought. So what's really strange is that when you say, I think I'm right, it has to be a feeling, but it has to feel like a thought. You have to feel like you've consciously initiated the process. So let me just try and explain a little bit how this might work. And I'm going to take a little term from AI, basically about hidden layer. Input, hidden layer, output. And if you think about it, if you're designing Amazon, every time you buy a new book, it gets more information about you, more stuff goes into the so-called hidden layer, and it builds up a background of what you buy, how often you look at one book and don't buy it, et cetera. And so, but our brain works exactly the same way. Without going into all the details, though, what I wanted to show you is that everything that makes a human being occurs primarily in the hidden layer. Our genetic and biologic predispositions, our memories, past experience, physical sensations that come from our body, etc. All of those collectively are like a gigantic committee that gets to vote on every one of your thoughts. They all sit there and let's say they each get one vote. Then an idea comes in your mind or something, and everybody raises their hand. If the votes are more in the yay than the nay, then it'll give you the likelihood of the value of that committee, that value of that idea being sent off into consciousness. So just to give you an example of how this might work in everyday terms, let's just take one simple behavioral model. Now, I don't mean to say that genes cause behavior in an absolute sense. Obviously, we're a mixture of nature, nurture, and all the rest of it. But for the moment, let's just say that genes have an influence on behavior. And let's use the example of risk-taking. Everybody here has a sense that they're a risk-taker. They start new businesses, etc. They have isolated a gene, a genetic difference in people that are high versus low risk takers. Those people that do skydiving, high stakes poker, etc., are much more likely on a statistical basis to have a dopamine receptor gene change that makes them actually need risky behavior in order to get the same degree of pleasure that people with a different set of dopamine receptors get for the same degree of pleasure. So these people are thrill seekers. Okay? Now let's call them positive risk-taking gene. Now let's start a second gene, add it into a second gene. This is one for laying down of fearful memories. What they did is they created a group of knockout mice where you take out one gene, and if the mice are normally somewhat timid, they explore the environment in a relatively nominal fashion, and they're very aversive to any kind of shocks. Those are the people who have the gene in place. They then knock out the gene, and these animals willy-nilly explore their environment. They are immune to shocks, etc. But most of all, they don't have any remaining memory of a trauma that you inflict on them the first time. So when you go back and put them in the thing, they haven't learned. The other animals, if they're shocked, they stay away from the stimulus. So they found out that these animals do not store fearful memories. So now imagine that you've got two groups of people. You've got one group that's risk aversive and has the normal gene for laying down fearful memories. Now imagine another group that has the risk-taking gene, so to speak, but that doesn't store fearful memories. If you envision the way we think as being this composite of all these people voting, the guy won't remember, in this committee, they will not remember past bad experiences. And they're all for risk in one group. The other group remembers every slight that they ever had, and they're rather timid. Now we'll give them a scenario. So just what do you think of normally when you see the oil spill in Valdez? I mean, what comes to mind first is an image generated from your unconscious. Everybody had an image as soon as I showed that picture. What was anybody just volunteer? What was the image? Sorry? Birds coated with oil. Supposing, on the other hand, though, you had the risk-taking gene and didn't store bad memories, and your first image was of long lines at the gas pumps. There is no common ground with which to start a discussion on how to treat this ecologic issue when people start with different images that they believe represent the situation. And I use that as an extreme example, but it's true when people think, when you get into a discussion with people and people talk about, let's say, global warming, one person sees a polar bear and another sees Sarah Palin. But your mind generates these instantaneously, and this then becomes the basis for, when combined with that calculation, combined with your own feeling of knowing, for different starting points for every single thought. There isn't an initial starting point for a thought that's free of these subterranean influences. So what I wanted to express, if nothing else today, is that certainty and the feelings of certainty aren't thoughts. They're not thought processes. When people talk about gut feelings and so, what they're really just talking about is the brain sending up a sensation in the same way as it sends up optical illusions, other visual perceptive changes like phantom limb pain, etc. It is your brain's way of saying, I think that's more likely to be right, but it's subject to all the perceptions that occur in the unconscious. And because I can't think of a better word, not that it's the best word, I refer to these as involuntary mental sensations. And if you can sort of imagine that you have a dashboard on your forehead, on the inside of your forehead, that sees which light goes off and how much, to what degree on your thoughts. You have a pretty good idea of the rightness of your thought, but you didn't think about it. It wasn't a thought. So I want to impress you, there is no such thing as a single correct line of reasoning. It's not possible. We see everything from our own particular viewpoint, and this then determines the way we feel about all the subsequent arguments that stem from the initial line of reasoning. And I think this last thing is very important. The presumption that each of us are presented with the same evidence should draw the same conclusion simply isn't so. So when you watch presidential debates and everybody assumes, well, if this is true, this is our tax deficit, then we should draw this. No, that's not how it works. We don't think that way, even though we like to think that way. This is sort of my feeling about the way we think. And to put it in a final perspective, if you could show that other slide. Okay, now I want you to watch this just so you can see this. What I'm going to ask you is, in what direction is this ball falling? Straight down? How many people vote for straight down? How many vote that it's going at an angle? Now we got both. It can't be both, can it? I mean, can it be both? It's either going straight or it's going at an angle. So look at it again. We should be able to come, this is as simple as it gets. This is a ball falling. We should be able to agree on how it's falling. Because if we can't agree on this, all right, let's try it again. How many people think that this is falling straight? Okay, how many people think that's falling at an angle? Okay, now look at the blue ball. And now out of the corner of your eye, see the Now, how is it falling now? Which is it? Is it falling at an angle or is it falling straight? Well, you're looking at the blue ball. Now look at the ball again, and then look at the blue ball and watch it. The ball. Can you see the ball move as you're doing it? So which is it? Mind you, this is just the simplest form of perception. Is there a correct answer to this? Which is it? Okay, then when you look at the blue ball, is it still going straight?
You don't think it is.
You don't think it is, but it is? You think? Well, there is an answer to this. The answer is that your peripheral visual receptors are seeing it differently than your central, your macula. But your brain is seeing both. But there isn't any truth in the ball. There are different truths depending on how you want to think. There is no truth about this particular ball falling. It's falling according to your perspective. Just the same way as those two lines that we see are according to your perspective and your culture. And that's really all I wanted to say.